Welcome to DC Chess Academy. Today, we'll be going over the showdown between Gukesh and Magnus in Norway Chess 2025. There are a lot of things you can take away from this game, so make sure you analyze this game with me thoroughly. Let's begin. Gukesh is playing white and Magnus is playing black. The game starts with e4, e5, knight f3, and knight c6, and Gukesh chooses bishop b5, the Rui Lopez opening, or the Spanish, which is the oldest opening in chess history. Magnus here plays the Berlin defense, which is regarded as a drawish line. Gukesh defends and plays this c3 move in order to expand with his pawns in the future and to limit the movement of this knight. Both sides castle and Magnus opens up his light squared bishop. Gukesh restricts its movement to g4 as allowing it would have let Magnus pin the knight. Magnus kicks out the bishop and then prevents white's dark squared bishop from pinning this f6 knight. Gukesh here supports the e4 pawn as he would like to play d4 in the future and guarding this pawn is beneficial. Magnus expands in the queen side and Gukesh moves back to c2, again adding some layers of protection to this pawn. Magnus calmly retreats his bishop back to b6 because he wants to play the move c5 and expand in the center. And here, Gukesh plays this knight d2 move, knight bd2. His plan is to go to f1, then to g3, and then to f4, f5, from where he can attack the black king easily. And Magnus is trying to do the same. He'll go to g6 and he'll come to f4 because even he wants to attack white's king. Here, Gukesh strikes in the queen side and tries to open up his rook by trading. Magnus moves out of the line of the rook and Gukesh now commits to the center. He plays d4 to unleash his pieces and just dominate the black pieces. However, Magnus carries on with his plans. His next move will probably be knight to f4. Gukesh also trying to take his knight to the f5 square. And here Magnus strikes in the center with c5. Gukesh is unbothered. He is not scared to maintain the tension in the center because after a few trades, this position is kind of drawish. The engine says zero point 0.0 and the position is pretty much symmetrical apart from these pawns. So this position is pretty boring. Let's see how both these players approach the game now. Magnus tries to target the weak e4 pawn and Gukesh blocks the vision of the bishop. Here, Magnus plays this sneaky a5 move in order to bring out his bishop via the a6 square from where it breathes fire upon this diagonal. Here, Gukesh tries to trade off black's powerful bishop with bishop to e3 while also developing. And here Magnus plays this counterintuitive move bishop to c8. Wasn't his plan to bring the bishop out to a6? Well, he realized that after his knight is on f4, he might be able to start a kingside attack by taking this h3 pawn, which is why bishop c8 was played. Here, Gukesh played b3 in order to partially negate the effect of the rook on the b file and also to solidify this bishop, and a trade took place. And Magnus, according to his plan, confidently moved his knight to f4 from where it attacked this pawn and just got really close to the white king. So, how will Gukesh try to avoid this possibly incoming attack? Gukesh moves his bishop to c6, which anchors the bishop in the opponent's territory. And here, Magnus plays rook to b4. The best move was actually bishop takes h3, and this looks crazy. But after the knight takes back and the other black knight joins in, this position is really uncomfortable to play for Gukesh because the black pawns are coming, the queen is staring towards this way, the rook is about to come and apply pressure. This just looks really messy for white. However, Magnus misses this and just plays rook to b4, attacking this weak e4 pawn again. Gukesh defends the pawn, and this is deemed as a mistake by the engine. Magnus here calmly plays g6 as he wants to bring the king out, create some and create some breathing space for his king. Gukesh plays what he considers an improving move, securing the king and tucking it away in the corner so that defense is easier. And we see Magnus moving his bishop to a6, move by move. His pieces are slowly coming out. And here, Gukesh makes yet another mistake. He surrenders the control of the d3 square while attacking the a5 pawn. But after Magnus plays bishop d3, doesn't that just hang the a5 pawn? That is true, but this flank pawn is less valuable than the center pawn on e4. So Gukesh desperately tries to hang on to the e4 pawn with knight to d2. Here, Magnus plays this creative h5 move in order to kick the knight away from the defense of the e4 pawn with the move h4. Gukesh here makes another mistake. What he should have done is doubled the rooks in order to protect the pawn again. But he takes the a5 pawn, and after a trade of queens, Magnus plays h4. And here Gukesh plays rook to a4. Wait, if Magnus takes, doesn't that just lose a knight? No, because after f takes g, this knight has to move, and after that, the bishop is gone. So, Magnus doubles up his rook and protects the rook on b4. Gukesh tries to play some second rank defense, and here, Magnus, cool as a cucumber, brings his king to g7. He knows he's winning here. Gukesh moves his rook to a7, trying to create some pressure on the 7th rank. And here, Magnus plays rook to d4, trying to bring his other rook into the action and also to protect the bishop. Gukesh here is desperate. He plays knight to f3, attacking both the pawn and the rook. But Magnus ignores it completely and takes the g3 knight because if Gukesh would have captured, G takes F would have led to promotion and subsequent loss. Therefore, Gukesh just took back the G3 pawn, and here, if Magnus moves back, he's just losing because he loses two of his main pieces in the attack, right? So, what Magnus does is he plays a tactic called a desperado. So, Magnus, a desperado is intended to think like Okay, I'm losing the knight anyways, so I might as well sacrifice it for the opponent's material. Magnus now takes the hanging e4 pawn and pins the knight. Gukesh moves out of the pin and Magnus plays this weird looking rook d1. But if Gukesh would get greedy and try to attack the f7 pawn, it would result in an immediate checkmate. That came out of nowhere. So Gukesh decided to create some breathing room for his king, and Magnus won yet another pawn. Gukesh knows he's cooked here. A trade of bishops takes place. Black's pawns are ready to roll down the board. How will Gukesh save this? He plays second rank defense. He attempts to. Magnus moves his knight to this beautiful f4 outpost. And after the rook moves away, Magnus's king joins the party in order to safely escort these pawns down the board. Gukesh plays h4, trying to restrict the movement of the king on the king side. Magnus continues with his plan, and here Gukesh plays knight to g5. What will Magnus do here? If he goes king to f6 like you would, he loses the game on the spot. So Magnus plays king d5. Alright, rook a5, a check, another check. Magnus's king coming closer to the white camp. And here, he makes a mistake. What he should have done was play f5, restricting the movement of white pieces onto the e4 square. However, he plays the move f4, f6, and after a series of checks, a trade of rooks takes place, and Magnus forks both these pawns. Gukesh forks both these pawns. Magnus attacks the f3 rook. The king steps in to defend, and the f6 pawn is threatened. And Magnus ignores the f6 pawn because he knows that these pawns will prove decisive. This position is approximately drawish, but it's hard to prove for white. So Gukesh takes the pawn, and here Magnus makes an error. He should have played rook to b4, planning to escort the pawn safely down the board. However, he attacks the knight, and after a check, Gukesh forks these two pawns, the pawn and the rook. The best move here for black is rook to e8, protecting the pawn. However, he plays a move that shocks the chess world due to time pressure. He plays knight e2 and he is completely losing because after rook takes knight, king takes, and knight takes rook, Magnus must have thought that these pawns can overpower both the king and the knight. However, he is mistaken as Gukesh slowly brings his knight towards towards these two connected passed pawns. If Magnus would play d2 here, Gokesh would simply go knight to e4, and after a promotion, he would fork these two pieces. Therefore, Magnus plays king e3 to restrict the movement of the knight. But that is not enough, as Gukesh moves his knight to the rim of the board, to the edge of the board. And after Magnus advances his other pawn, Gukesh creates a passed pawn. Both sides have two passed pawns. This is getting tense. Magnus moves his king out of the way of the e pawn, and Gukesh tries to defend the d1 square. Magnus makes another mistake in an already losing position due to time pressure. Here, Gukesh goes knight c4 check and plays king f4, and it is in this position that Magnus slams the table and resigns. because this pawn will be lost, and after d2 knight takes e3, the pawn will be lost anyways, and white will push his pawns to victory. So there's a lot you can learn from Gukesh's resilience and his attitude of not giving up. There are also a lot of instructive moments in this game, like when Magnus was relentlessly pressuring this e4 pawn. So there's a lot to learn. I encourage you to analyze the game in your free time. Thanks for watching Train to Win.